Good morning and welcome to Adult Education at Valley Community Presbyterian Church in Golden Valley. My name is Jim Cook and I am a parish associate here. Today's topic is a non-racist is not an anti-racist. There are lots of topics we could use today. We could talk about our COVID-19 virus and what it has done to us as a community. But we can also take a look at other things that do have effect on us as a community. One of them is what we have identified as systemic racism. And in order to look at that, I thought it was important for us maybe to dig back a little bit more basically and just get down to the basics of how we got to where we are. Just about 10 days ago, the Star Tribune published in its paper an extra insert entitled Giving Back. And the subtitle of that was Philanthropy Teams Up with the Arts in a Renewed Drive for Racial Justice. I'm glad that it teams up for racial justice, but I'm often wondering why giving and racial justice seem to be married to each other. It was a great piece, and the inspiring art and the inspiring articles were moving, and there were some very pointed pieces about giving some funds to support some of those who are poor, some of those who are challenged, some of those who are vulnerable, and also perhaps to develop some funds that would build up some of the renew some of the properties that were destroyed during our recent summer of discontent. It was far more than an appeal for funds. But I fear that some people will see it just as that and will feel that once they have given funds, they have done something to overcome racism. If you give some money to help those in need, that's all you need to do. My mom, for those of you who know me, mom number 2, used to say, "We don't have much, but we have more than those poor colored folks in North Minneapolis. So when we get a chance, we should give something," as a special offering plate was passed down the pews at the First Congregational Church of Robbinsdale back in 1940. And this little 5-year-old looked at that and said, "Oh boy, are we ever doing something to help the poor colored folks?" And when I left church, I never thought of it again. For many, supporting a cause that directly assists those of different race is evidence of the fact that I am not a racist. However, when you help a person in need, you're not an anti-racist. You are a humanitarian. It may have something to do with what you believe is race, but there is only one race: human. And to believe there are many races is to buy the propaganda that we've been sold long, long ago, that one human race was superior, the one without color. And those with color fell into certain hierarchies: white at the top, black at the bottom, and the other colors in between. We created those races. They were not created by some creative God who had decided to color us differently so there'd be some variety or some challenge. We created races for status determination. Some of us humans believe, I'm one of those, that I have moved beyond treating people of color differently than we treat us ashen folks. Many who have color know that in most cases, that's simply a self-delusion. Saying, "I have some colored friends and race doesn't bother me," is not an affirmation that I'm not a racist. And even if it were, it is not an affirmation that I'm an anti-racist. There is quite a difference. So this morning I want to offer us maybe 3 thoughts kind of as a midrash, something to chew on, something that you might think through as you deal with your white supremacy. Okay, white supremacy. Many people hear that and say, well, that doesn't include me. Even for those who believe they are not white supremacists, white supremacy is rooted in the belief of the superiority of male whiteness, and it bestows benefits, unearned rights, rewards, opportunities, advantages, access, and privilege to us, mostly us European or European descent, or in Minnesota, Northern European descent, yeah, sure, you betcha. Let me take a few minutes in each of three areas, centered on three questions. What is black theology? Racism, how did we get here? And how can Jesus help us get out of where we got to? That seems to me to be the question we all ought to always ask ourselves about anything if we claim to follow Jesus. My guru, on the board I put three names. My guru for black theology is Dr. Charles Latimer Howard. Charles is a chaplain at the University of Pennsylvania. My guru for racism, how did we get here, is Dr. Velda R. Love. She is the Minister of Racial Justice for the United Church of Christ. Both of these two have darker complexions than I. And then thirdly, Carl Krieg. Dr. Carl Krieg I use to help keep me straight about some of the things that I have come to believe about Jesus. Dr. Krieg caught me 4 years ago with a little book that he wrote called The Void and the Vision, how Jesus fills the void and gives us a vision. And then recently he wrote a blog entitled The Other Virus, confirming the belief that one virus is COVID-19 and the other virus is incompetence. One virus is running rampant, the other seems to have been recently curtailed. I leave those there, by the way, on the board, so those of you who want to jot them down, who want to fact check me to see if anything I'm presenting is false news, you'll be able to do that. Before we look at black theology, maybe we ought to look at theology. What is theology? Theology is the study of our relationship with God or with the divine. Comes from theos, which means divine or God, and logos, which means word, divine word, God talk. God talk. Word comes from that. Theology needs to be way more than talk. Theology needs to grow some legs and move. It's not just good thoughts that go nowhere and gather dust. Theology is a lot like belief. I'm not a person who says you can believe anything you want to believe, but you can. But that everything you believe is okay. But nothing you believe matters if it doesn't get you to do something. It doesn't matter if it doesn't do. And what it does grows out of the basic soil in which it's planted. If you want a carrot, you go to the garden and you pull out what you planted and it's a radish and you say, I wanted a carrot. You get what you plant. That's why we plant a garden, not just one vegetable. You don't just plant in white theology. Because if you plant in white theology, it will give you a white God to talk about. Like a God like Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel, whose finger touched white man, male. Where did that whiteness come from? If you harvest with white people who think and believe like you do, it grows in an affirmation of what you think and believe. You can claim that you're returning to your roots. You're establishing what grows is right. But if it's a white growth, any foreign thought, anybody who comes in with a preconception that's different than the white folks who are studying white theology have, that person needs to be repelled. That person needs to be ignored. That person needs to be debased, even dispatched. Black theology. Black theology is a new construction or a reconstruction of the theological thoughts and the ensuing actions. Thinking of God as white and positing the Logos as white, Jesus has locked us into some awfully difficult, tragic courses of inaction. Black theology seeks the inclusion of color, and sometimes it's referred to as liberation theology. Let's plant in human soil. The God talk black theology seeks is one that plants that Logos seed as human, not as white. Many of the Presbyterian Church's recent theological and even social justice pronouncements have talked about reaching to those on the fringes of our society. Whites have put blacks on the fringes. Blacks do not want to stay there. As long as they're there, we whites have some for whom we can say we are our brother's keeper. We can take care of those poor folks in North Minneapolis. Blacks do not want to be kept any more than you do. Blacks want brothers and sisters, not keepers. Black theology brings the marginalized into the center, not to replace the center, but to expand it. To expand the center so that those who have been discounted can be counted. I want to make this as simple as I can. Black theology is not looking for an invitation to our table. When we invite someone to our table that isn't usually there and they come, we feel good. Black theology is not looking to make us feel good. Black theology wants to be at the table with us, helping us to make it bigger, so that we together can be reaching to those who need to know that they belong at the table too. Because blacks and people of color no longer want to be them. They want to be us. They want to have changes made to make this the day that we are all one. I have millennial grandchildren who say that they do not understand why our generation hasn't made that change and brought that about. And I don't like to look at them and say, well, because we're going to leave it up to you. I don't know how many years I got left, but I'm going to leave it up to me. We'll work on it. Black Lives Matter is a theological and a cultural movement. Dr. Howard says that liberation theology, let's be contemporary, liberation theology asks these questions. Is God lying with us at the intersection of 38th and Chicago as we mourn the death of our brother George? Is the Christ who died on the cross for us dying at that intersection? Does God care about those of us who have had knees put on our necks? How do we get all of that into our religious institutions? Here's one. Do you, who have oppressed us for so long, kneel now with us, as we all saw when we watched the protests? Kneel now with us because you are willing to do the hard work necessary to bring about the change in pronouns from them to us, from they to we. See, the God we created, the God we say sees white, is not the creative force of life. Life is the creative force that has evolved so far to include humans. I don't know what's next, but something's next. Black theology exists only because it needs to burst this bubble. It needs to burst the bubble of those of us who have never seen our theology as anything, never seen theology as anything but white. Black theology says we all matter, and in the course of life, one thing comes consistently to the forefront. Love your neighbor as one who matters, just as you want to be loved and treated as one who matters. Black liberation theology seeks inclusion of people of color, just as parallel mass movements have sought inclusion of women and gays and all those who have felt us pushing them to the fringe. How did we get to this point in our evolutionary history where we have seen white males as superior? Racism. How did we get here? Looking to the beginning, looking to answer that question often leads us Christians to scriptures, to Genesis 1:1. And we start our answer from a text which was written by Jewish priests 2,650 years ago. The beginning that is recorded in Genesis 2:4b was written by Jewish Yahwists, is older, 3,100 years ago, but it doesn't have that same kind of beginning sound that the priests wanted to offer. 6 days with the culmination in the creation of male and female, and then a seventh day when God could rest so the priests could take over and lay down some laws that we might call in this country blue laws. Actually, both of those beginnings are not the beginning, neither one. They are a beginning. And the reason they're a beginning is because the earth is not 3,100 years old, it's 400 billion years old. And there are all kinds of creation stories that roll during those developing years. Humans are of African origin, or so our evidence from archaeology would suggest. The oldest Homo sapien male is a skull that was discovered of a male 300,000 years ago in Ethiopia. He lived in Ethiopia 300,000 years ago. Mitochondrial woman, 300,000 years ago in that African Fertile Crescent. Eva was the word for that mitochondrial woman, Eva. All living things came from Eva. 97% of our DNA, of every living thing's DNA, according to geneticists. Genesis. Africa is the cradle of civilization. And we have to get back there if we're going to say we're going to go to the beginning to see how we got here. Africa is the cradle of civilization and one of the earliest and the most spectacular civilizations of humanity. An attempt to describe that occurs in our scriptures in Genesis, the 2nd chapter, verses 10 to 14, where there's a lot of information about a place called Eden. Now, I know you know that I am definitely a cartographer and that my ability to draw maps is unequaled. I'll demonstrate. Africa. I mean, you all knew that. Here's Sinai. Sinai is the only part of Asia that's governed by an African country. Saudi Arabia, which was once called the Valley of Eden. There's Turkey, Syria, Iran, Iraq. It says in Genesis 2, 10 through 14, that there was this garden. And it was bounded by Cush on the east and the Tigris Euphrates on the west. The river was the Gihon. Rivers flow north in Africa. It starts in Lake Victoria. There's another that's called the White Nile, White Gihon, the Blue Gihon. So now we have the Gihon, which is one of the 4 rivers in Eden. We have Cush, which is Ethiopia. And over here we have the Tigris and the Euphrates. And so this distance right here, this area right here, I should have drawn it a little better, is called the Fertile Crescent. It is considered the birthplace of Africa, of agriculture. It's where things grow. It's where things come to life. It's as the evolutionary track reaches the earth and the sun bakes it, stuff sprouts, and humans live. Africa is the cradle of civilization. I say all that because as this whole thing is developing, the Christian faith, eventually the Jewish faith, the Muslim faith, they walk alongside each other in one of the greatest civilizations that there has ever been. You need to know that simply to help you answer the question, racism. How did we get there? Somehow when we trace our Christian religious development, we end up in Europe. And I can't spend enough time, there isn't enough time for me to get you from Africa to Europe, but a lot of racism, how we got there, comes definitely out of the whiteness that was developed in those early years, including the Crusades from the 11th to the 13th century, and all of the, by the way, mostly unsuccessful as far as Christians were concerned. In 1452, a doctrine of discovery was issued by a papal bull from Nicholas V from the Vatican. It was considered the crux of international law. And what that international law said was that it is the order for those who are Christian to colonize and explore and exploit non-Christian territories and take them over, if necessary, to make them Christian. If it meant dispatching the people who were there, so it meant. In I think it was 40 years later, 1490 something, there was another papal bull, another papal decree that said all people who threaten the livelihood of superior whites should be removed from the face of the earth. That was even impactful by the Protestant Reformation of 1517. Dr. Love, for those fact checkers, Dr. Love contends that the Christian church not only defended white supremacy, but it promoted it because they had been carefully taught about their superiority. Think about this reality. We're in the 1800s in the United States of America, 1816, somewhere around in there. Chief Justice John Marshall found it constitutional for President Andrew Jackson to do what was called replacement. And replacement was the removal of all Cherokee Indians from that state we call Georgia, which we paid a little attention to lately, to remove the Cherokee Indians from Georgia so that white people could occupy. It's a systemic reality being confronted and confirmed in our current era. The call is to do something about that. The call is because this is where we have got to in our country. Those we have pushed to the fringe want to get to the center. We passed an act in 1865 called the Emancipation Proclamation and even made a 13th Amendment to our Constitution about it. We passed an act in 1965 called the Voters' Rights Act, and we said this means everybody in this country has a right to go to the polls, and then we said neither of those can be applied because white males are being threatened by both of those, being threatened about being replaced. And you have to do everything you can to stop that kind of encroachment, everything you can to keep that which we have worked so hard to achieve intact. It's a belief that was carefully taught. It's a belief religiously and governmentally sanctioned. It's a systemic reality. And in order to use any means possible to preserve it, it's the only way some people think you can keep America great. The call. Bring in those who have been pushed to the fringe into the center. I'm not sure that we have to invite those on the fringe into the center. I think we have to get out of the way and let them be there. I often talk about not being keepers, that we ought to be brothers and sisters. Think about a keeper. Think about a zookeeper. Think about the animal kept in a cage. If a zookeeper just thinks his job is to feed and take care of, that relationship is never going to be of any feeling, any reality. But if that zookeeper opens the cage door and allows the lion to come out, the keeper better get out of the way. There's going to be some violence if you have been in a cage for all these centuries. Don't keep your fellow humans love them as brothers and sisters, to celebrate our diversity, to reclaim the theology of liberation, to allow us to do justice and love kindness and let that be our embrace. We have to discover a new way to breathe fresh spirit. That's the mandate. Just how are we supposed to let that happen, to make that happen? How will our theology be not radically, but just appropriately changed? How will our claim of history discover its roots rather than tend its transplants, the transplants to Europe, for example? There is a way. There is a truth. It's not the story that we have been told to believe about the way and truth. It's not the story, I believe, the one that was ever intended to be told. There are some hints at those roots, by the way. I think from Matthew's creation story, where we have to get Jesus to Africa for his safety and his development and his birthright. However, no one ever said to me, Jesus came out of Africa, and so did you. That's a whole new understanding for me, perhaps for you. Jesus, a Jewish male, born in the Middle East. What would that tell us then? Therefore, he's a male who's likely short, maybe over 5 feet tall. Has very dark curly hair and beard, and his skin is very dark. Now, that image may not be the same image of Jesus for you that you picture. But if you can picture him that way, you may have begun to reach a different, maybe even more accurate understanding of his influence on life and on you. I grew up, I suppose those of you my age can claim this as well. I grew up with Warner Salomon's portrait of Jesus. If you don't know Warner Salomon's portrait, let me just say what I used to say in a non-very religious way. It looks like he just came out of a beauty shop. Not the Jesus who fought and gave his life for those who were suffering and dying and were ostracized from the Pharisees, the hypocrites, the scribes, the powers. Dr. Krieg asserts that some think a person culturally bound to the first century, Jesus, would have little application to the circumstances of today in the United States of America. But that's not so. Jesus lived under the suffocating hands of Roman tyrants, Caesar Augustus, Tiberius Caesar, during the lifetime of Jesus, who insisted, what is a tyrant? One who insists that everything be the way they want it to be. In Jesus' time, the wealthy oppressed the poor. There was a great deal of difference between the 1% and the 99%. The ruling empire survived by the work of slaves. How did they get slaves? The wealthy taxed the poor to such an extent that the poor could not pay the tax, and the only way they could pay it was to be an indentured servant, to be a slave. Life was enough like life now that it makes me wonder, does it always have to be this way? Because of Jesus, I know. The answer is no. but it depends on what you are willing to do when you follow Jesus to break that bond. How can this first century Jesus inspire us? How can we change our ways? How can we crack the lock of the cage of racism? He obviously inspires people to follow him, to follow his lead. Why do you suppose 12 men, fishermen, tradesmen, tax collector, zealot, money manager, how do you suppose those 12 men would have decided to leave what they were doing and follow Jesus? Did they follow him because they believed he was the Messiah? That he was some kind of miracle worker? That he was a mystic? Did they follow him because he could walk on water? Because he could feed 5,000 people? I think the answer decisively is no, that's not why they followed. These disciples followed not because they believed in Jesus, maybe not even because they believed Jesus. They followed him because they experienced Jesus. How do you do that? How do you experience Jesus? That experience showed them not only who he was and how he lived, but it showed them how they were and how they could live. Life on earth, that's the gift, to be all you can be here. And those scribes and Pharisees and hypocrites who kept telling you, you got to do this and this and this and this so that you can get to the life that really matters, forget that, Jesus said. You do now what I call you to do. And it's time to make sure that others could also be all that they could be. If you see anybody being oppressed, do something. You see, the truth of Jesus is his humanity. It's how he lives the human reality that is the power. How does he do that? By relating to him, the disciples and we learn that our power is also in how we live our lives. You don't influence anybody by saying what it is you think is right. You influence people by doing what you know needs to be done because it's the right thing to do. Perhaps what we thought clearly was essential was for us to get out of life as much as we could and then to guard it very carefully after we had achieved it. That's radically different from what Jesus reveals as he lives his life. I think relating to Jesus is a time of discovery. It's a time when we learn what the ingredients of full life are. What is the first ingredient of a full life? I believe it's humility. I believe it's the humility of self and the embracing of others. I'll put all others. Jesus is not egocentric. Perhaps most of us are. Perhaps most of us are egocentric, even though those of us who are egocentric outnumber the ones who would admit that they were. Jesus is not self-centered. Jesus does not think he thinks of himself, but not only of himself. He's not concerned in every instance about what's in this for me. In embracing the other, the first reality in embracing the other is our common humanity. You're hearing nothing about color here. There isn't any. It's human. Color is what we are in one of the ingredients of who we are. Human is the core. Jesus embraces the core of every human, calls us to do the same, humbly. That the other person is not more nor less than Jesus, than you. The focus is always on the other by the one who said he came to serve and not be served, and who also said, you ought to do what I do. Some people sometimes called him a king. If that's true, if you went to his throne room, you'd find that Jesus was not sitting on the throne. He'd put you there. He's on his knees washing your feet. Humility is the ingredient that begins a necessary break in what we have been led to believe. And the second reality is close to that. It's inclusion, which means listening. It means listening to another human being's desire for life and desires for contributing to life. I have been a white man for all my life, and until recently I thought that meant I was able to look at other people's lives and know what they needed. I didn't have to ask them. I could tell them what they needed, what they lacked. Here, I can see you need this. Why not listen to them? Why not hear their needs if they have them? And maybe have them join you. There may be needs in this contribution of life. Matthew 25, hunger, thirst, outsider, homeless, sick, prison. But inclusion does not simply mean responding to the need. If you respond to a person's need, that's charity. And charity is momentarily. It's for now. Jesus said, follow me. That's an invitation that means you're going to walk alongside the one you embrace. You're going to walk alongside until you see that one embracing others. And then there'll be more to walk along. Following doesn't mean looking for someone to help. It means seeing someone who matters. That's justice. Charity's for now, justice forever. The third reality. The third reality is loving outrageously. Following Jesus means seeing a fellow human being being abused, and stepping alongside. It means caring for the other to such a degree that if a critical decision needs to be made, it will be made in favor of the other, even if that means disturbing your comfort level. You are not here to be comfortable. You're here to be meaningful. Outrageous love is often reparative. When one's eyes are open to see that another has maybe been treated as less than human for as long as say, 400 years. Once in relationship with Jesus, one begins to understand the reality that life's rewards are not cars and homes and boats and jobs and investments and money. Life's rewards, full life's rewards, are filled with opportunities for you to share that life with others, for you to meaningfully and openly expect that by loving those others, their lives will be transformed just as yours has been transformed. We'll be known by our love, by what we have. Known by our love. There ought to be a hymn like that. The truth of our humanity, friends, is so apparent in the life of Jesus. It requires that we need to deconstruct our self-centeredness so that we can connect with our fellow humans and thereby connect with life and love. The truth of our humanity is to embrace our fellow human beings as kindred spirits, not as threatening others. The truth of our humanity is to be open to the loving Spirit that surrounds us and supports us in communion with co-conspirator humans who are like us because they are human. The truth is, this is who we are. The truth is that we are people who love. The truth is that we are people who are following Jesus. Those of you who are streaming and listening this morning, we follow Jesus, so that means we get in good trouble. We get in necessary trouble. Thank you, John. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, among the thousands of things he said, love even for enemies is the key to the solution of the problems of the world. Jesus is not, King said, Jesus is not an impractical idealist. He is a practical realist. I want to close these words this morning with a couple of thoughts to begin to dismantle our racism and begin to stand against it as an anti-racist. The first you know well. You've heard it a lot lately, I trust. When you see something that is not right, when it's not fair, when it's not just, you have to speak up. You have to say something. You have to do something. John Lewis. Thank God for John Lewis. Thank life for John Lewis. Jesus of Nazareth, love one another as I have loved you. To make that contemporary, hear this. Love one another as I have loved you. Wear a mask. Amen. God be with you.